Again, welcome everyone to our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion panel on inclusivity in Morris dancing. Welcome, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. So this panel came out of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion statement that Morris Ale published earlier this summer. So this statement was really made to begin conversations. And we decided to bring this panel together to help make this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion not be at a large organizational level, but tangible enough for you to bring home to your teams. This the first of many panels, because you cannot have just one conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion and call it quits. You can't just release a statement and say that's good enough. The work is being done, and it takes a lot of conversations and a lot of patience, and some of us are deeper into the work than others. So we hope that this is the Kickstarter for you, for us as a community, to have these conversations in a safe space and to grow with each other. That's all I have to say on that one. Okay, let's meet our panelists. Our moderator today is going to be President of the Midwest Morris Ale, Katie Leach. She is currently out of St. Louis, dances with the River Rats and Capering Roysters. She, in her professional life, Katie is a school teacher in a predominantly minority community and is engaged in activism for diversity. In alphabetical order by first name, our panelists are Bob Walser, who you heard us play in for all of us. Thank you, Bob. Bob has a long history in Morris with many teams across the United States. Bob harbors a deep love for Morris culture and the spirit of the community and human connection. He is currently a dancer and musician with Ramsey's Braggarts in the Twin Cities. Bob is also involved with community farming projects and the Minneapolis Board of Education. Next we have Chris Bracken. She is, are you still Squire of Rock Creek? Good. Chris is moving this weekend, which is why I have these questions. But Chris is currently Squire of Rock Creek Morris Women in DC. Those of you in the Midwest will know her from her stay in Minneapolis, doing her legal school internship a couple years ago. She also is involved with the Youth Tread Song Weekend, so I'm sure many of you have seen her there as well. She is also a fantastic social justice inclined LU as Chris. And then last but not least, we have Tango. Tango was born and raised into a social justice lifestyle. Tango is in the Twin Cities and is currently the Squire and musician for Brackleberry Morris. So thank you all panelists and moderator. Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. I'm Katie Leach. I am the current president of Midwest Morris Ale organization, and I'm excited to be a part of the work that we're doing in our community as we think about ourselves, our practices, and our traditions. As Valerie talked about at the beginning, this DEI statement, which then birthed this conversation today, came out of a conversation as we reviewed our code of conduct, our policies and procedures, and how we were currently doing things. So I'm going to read the DEI as a foundation for what we're talking about today. This is also available on our website if you'd like to read it in full. Part of the MWMA's mission is sharing traditions, dances, and practices with each other. Morris dancers are often eager learners and sharers. As the Morris tradition is old and came about from working class roots, there is much still being researched and documented about traditional practices, techniques, and archetypes. We are still learning about our traditions, both in terms of historical dance styles from the English Morris dancing and in terms of how we come together to dance today in the United States. Our community has been and continues to be devoted to celebrating, renewing, and developing Morris dance practices. The MWMA community takes seriously its obligation to review tradition, not just celebrate successes, but to also acknowledge problematic or harmful practices. Some Morris traditions have racist, sexist, homophobic, or bigoted roots. Recently, there have been pushes from white supremacist rhetoricians who would like to use a traditional space, which grew out of the culture of England, as a breeding ground for hate and bigotry and the valorization of white culture. We of the MWMA denounce this movement and will not accept its presence in our spaces or the presence of behavior, remarks, costumes, face paint, or ideas that promote white supremacy, racist practices, or racial stereotypes. The MWMA stands with our members of color, queer folk, members of different genders, classes, creeds, and faiths. Our priority is to make the Morris community more whole and safe for all its members. We require all attendees of our events to follow the Code of Conduct, which promotes inclusivity and does not permit bigoted speech or acts. As an organization, we recognize that combating racism and bigotry is not a simple process, and it requires ongoing work. Our Code of Conduct enforcement procedures and policies are currently under a several months long review by a team of workers, preparing them to meet the growing demands of the virtual and in-person community events. Many of our constituent teams have reviewed their traditional practices and are tackling problems involving racist, sexist, homophobic, or bigoted ideas. Though the MWMA community has started this work, we understand that there is still much to be done, some of which is long overdue. We are devoted to listening, understanding, and building up voices that historically haven't had the space they were owed. With this in mind, we hope that our Morris research and documentation will help further growth and development within Morris teams who would like to be stronger together. Please review our Code of Conduct as well as our policies and procedures, and reach out to us if you have thoughts to share about any of this. At this time, I'd like to begin talking to our panelists. Because much of this work takes place in conversation between different groups sharing their experiences. First off, I'd like to give a definition of the word inclusion, which has a number of definitions depending on who you're consulting. But today we'll go with inclusion is an organizational effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed and equally treated. These differences could be self-evident, such as national origin, age, race, and ethnicity, religious belief, gender, marital status, and socioeconomic status, or they could be more inherent, such as educational background, training, sector experience, organizational tenure, or even personalities, such as introverts and extroverts. Question to the three panelists. What are the components of Morris dance community that are inclusive?
So I will jump in just, I think we have a lot of work to do. First of all, I'm delighted to be here and thank you. It's really, really fun to be part of these conversations. I'm always happy to do it. I think it's important to talk about what we need to be doing differently, but it's really also important to point out what we do well. And I think the Morris community is great at making space for people who are not neurotypical, for people who sometimes have social challenges. We are so good at that. We are so embracing of those folks. And having been raised in a folk community, in a Morris community, I've always been just amazed and delighted by that. we are also very engaging of strangers. I mean, we go out and dance in public, and at any time, I mean, how many of you, you know, every tour, someone comes up to you and says, what is this thing you're doing? Where's it from? And there's always one of us who's willing to go have that conversation and say, hey, and also we practice on Tuesdays and, you know, please come be part of it. You know, I think I've lived in a bunch of different places and danced with a bunch of different teams, and that's always a constant, that we actively invite people to come into this tradition. And I think those are really strong starting places.
And I would add to that that the context for dancing can also be an occasion for that as well. Since Morris is often a celebratory kind of thing, here in Minneapolis, May Day is a big deal, not just on May Day itself, but also a celebration that happens at Powderhorn Park, which draws a really diverse audience from all over the city. And in that context, Morris fits right in, and the kinds of conversations that you just mentioned are lots of them happen, and that's a part of it too. So that's piggybacking on what you just said.
In my experience, there's a lot of different roles for people to be in Morris, because I started as a dancer, and now that my body is not allowing me to dance as much as I used to, I'm musician and squire, so I was able to easily flow from one to the next, since there's so many moving parts in the Morris community as it is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. My mom tried dancing, discovered that her knees were not going to let her do it. And for 20 years, she was the hobby animal for the team that I grew up on in Albany, New York. And she would put on this unicorn costume and hand out flyers and loved participating that way. And has never been a Morris dancer at all.
Other thoughts about inclusive practices? How do you see that the Morris community has changed over time with respect to being inclusive and being welcoming of people? What changes have occurred?
Well, from my my perspective, over many years, going back to the when I danced in DC, and there was a split, whatever, the whole gender thing has completely opened up from when I started Morris dancing. I mean, it was beginning to open up back in the 70s when I began dancing, but it was almost a hot button in some cases in those days. And my perception is that it's just simply accepted now that there's all kinds of ways to do it, and they're all welcome, and that's fine. Full stop. So that's changed, certainly. And if you go back and hear stories of the Morris Ring and teams in England, that's a huge change from what it was.
Go ahead if you'd like.
I was just going to say really quickly that one of the things, I mean, this kind of wanders off in a slightly different direction, but it's been really useful for me. You know, I think one of the elements of inclusivity is a variety of people of different ages and welcoming people as they're young and as they grow and as they are getting older. And one of the things that has been a really useful, I mean, it's always been very useful to me, right, to have these mentors and folks who have had that history and that experience. Because I think sometimes folks in my generation encounter gender separation and are like, what is this? We don't need this. You know, I'm teaching a class to some tweens right now, and they're like, why should sports be separated between genders? That's stupid. And they have this very, you know, and I too have some of this, like, we don't need that. Why aren't we all together? And it's been very illustrative for me to have conversations with women who were around in the 70s and really struggled with feeling like they were even able, you know, we're like, men will not teach us to dance. They will not let us show up. They are being very hostile. And it felt really important to them, and still does to some folks, to have women's only teams in those spaces. And that was something that was really important for me to hear that experience and kind of understand why, like, a little bit about the history and about individual experiences of that history, and how that leads people to have strong opinions that I don't necessarily understand, right? And that's part of why just having more conversations and more individual connection is part of how we progress, because we understand a little bit more about where each other's coming from.
Yeah, I think I really like what you were saying, and thinking about it in terms of that there can be spaces for all kinds of different things. There can be women's only or men's only or mixed, or, you know, pick your moniker or group that you want to be part of. I think the thing that from my perspective has changed, and I view it as an improvement, is that, okay, let's have that kind and this kind and that. There's no one right way. The right way is the way that works for a community that that's successful and feeds a community. And there can be lots of different right ways. There's not one single one.
Other thoughts about how we've changed over time?
Well, the one I have to mention is, and I don't know that this is a change over time, but it's something that I really celebrate all the time. And that is, if you look at the picture behind me, that's actually the Abram Morris on the Morris Dancers ground in the village of Abram. And the way that the Midwest Morris community specifically has transformed that dance into something that we share, and we share in a way that's absolutely gorgeous. We don't dance it the way the Abram men dance it. We've transformed it into something else, but we've made something really beautiful out of that. And I just have to shout out to everybody, to the Chicago people who sort of created the Midwest version of it, I guess. But everybody sort of chipped in over time, and it's become this thing, and it's wonderful.
Other thoughts on how we've changed over time? A little bit more evaluative than, rather than descriptive. In your own thinking, how far have we come as a Morris community in terms of creating more inclusive, reflective practices?
Well, I would say that would vary by team. It's really, I would only be, I can't speak for the larger group, but I can say that these conversations are certainly happening within the teams that I'm involved in. But I would hesitate to speak for any larger aggregation.
Yeah, I mean, I also, I have a couple different perspectives from being in slightly different places geographically, but yeah, I think my experience has been that there are different conversations in different places, and large gatherings like the Ales allow us to kind of have some feedback loops and some places where things inform other things. I mean, I had a moment, I don't know, back in the before times, at the beginning of this year sometime, where a friend from the Toronto Morris men emailed me and said, "Hey, what are you guys saying instead of half jip? Because we need to know. We're gathering ideas." And I went, "Oh crap, we're not. Oh, we need to have that conversation. Crap," and in that dialogue back and forth with him, he was saying, like, we've been trying using this inside joke, and here's how we're kind of solving it. But he had sort of expected our team to be having that conversation. And I was like, I'm in charge and we're not. We have to have that conversation. And similarly, I think, sometimes I will be the one saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing about this?" And members of other teams will go, "Yup, that's something that we should put on our list." Okay. And so I think there's an element of, it passes around like so many other, like dances pass between us, and things get added on and changed, and we share and adjust ideas to fit, our local context.
I don't really have a lot to say on it. I've only been on Brackleberry since 2014. So I came like post gender inclusivity and all that. Obviously, I would not be here if it wasn't an inclusive space. So that's what I have to say about that.
And I'm glad you're here.
Thinking a little bit about a vision of a Morris community that would be post transition, what vision do you guys have of a like anti-racist, anti-bigotry, inclusive Morris community? What would that look like? Whether that be in terms of gender or in terms of other identity inclusive spaces.
I think some of it is about seats at the table, and we don't know what we don't know kind of stuff, right? We don't hear the perspectives of folks who are not part of our community. And so, you know, we kind of do our best and we're trying to educate ourselves, and having these conversations is a great start. But I think part of it is we don't know the pieces we're missing necessarily. And I would say, particularly with respect to race, I mean, I think some of the other axes of inclusion, we have some folks who are part of the community. And obviously, you know, the work should not be entirely on those folks to explain to us how to be inclusive, right? We all have to do our work, but those perspectives are here and can say like, hey, actually, you know, I am an older person and I'm having some feelings about how this situation is set up, or like I have, you know, a physical disability that is preventing my access to some of your spaces, and like, hey, can we work on that? And I think particularly with respect to race, we don't have as many of those voices. One of the things, we're having a lot of this sort of conversation about diversity and inclusion with Youth Traditional Song Weekend, and we had a conversation at YTS 2 years ago that was really instructive for me. And I feel like one of the main things I got out of that with respect to racial diversity in our community was that the project is not diversity, the project is anti-racism. And, you know, we don't want tokenism, and we don't want to bring people of color into our spaces so that we feel better about them being diverse. It's really important for us to be thinking about what would make those folks comfortable, what would make our community feel like a safe place to be, where they know they're not going to hear racial epithets, or they're not going to see blackface, things like that. And then if the outcome of that anti-racist work is a more racially diverse community, great. Like, that's delightful if that's a side benefit, but it shouldn't be the project. And I realize that doesn't actually answer what does a vision of an anti-racist community look like. But I do think that it's important for us to kind of agree that that's the first step, is to work on what would make people of color feel safe in our communities and maybe feel excited about participating in our communities. And then, you know, but either way, that is a valuable project on its own, regardless of whether that means people of color join our teams or show up in our events. Yeah.
That calls to mind something I was thinking about earlier today, that a couple of the people that I've heard talking about these topics in different contexts, actually, in the context of agriculture and also the context of education. A couple of people who I really look up to as thought leaders in this area, who emphasized that it was that being strong in knowing your own culture and not sacrificing who you are in order to make space for some other that you don't maybe even fully understand. So being having a clear vision of what your, you know, what our, in this case, you know, for this conversation, what our collective culture, what it is and what we want it to look like, is a part of that. That was, I've been thinking about that piece after we had our initial sort of chit chat about what we were going to talk about. That piece came up in my thinking. I think yeah, go ahead.
I think as far as like the vision for what an inclusive Morris community is, honestly looks a lot like the Twin Cities Morris community. I'm just going to keep Twin Cities, Twin Cities this whole panel. But we have quite a bit of gender diversity, age diversity, neurodiversity spectrum. Like we have that pretty much down. And obviously like we could definitely do with more ethnic diversity. But I think, you know, the community here in the Twin Cities is very accepting. People are very encouraging, and it helps that we've got so many different teams. So really there's spots for anybody and everybody who wants to do it.
Any additional thoughts about a vision for a Morris community that is anti-bigoted?
Well, I think we do have an opportunity because of the fact that it is a performative tradition. So we have the opportunity to move in, possibly to move into spaces and live a more anti-racist being in community spaces. You know, when for example, there are what was it called, Northern Spark, the nighttime arts event that happened here, which all kinds of people, or the May Day event at Powderhorn Park, are two occasions when really diverse audiences we can encounter and interact with. And that's the key. How do we interact with a really diverse audience? Can we do that in a way that really is inclusive, that really is welcoming, and which to me seems like, well, of course, that's what we would want. That's what I want to do anyway, for sure.
Any other thoughts on this question with the anti-bigoted Morris community? It was mentioned in another conversation that one of the important parts of soliciting feedback from various communities and from just receiving feedback is learning how to take that feedback and not make it about you. Are there any thoughts that you guys have about how to receive feedback, how to get called out and not die over it?
Who had that story? Somebody had a story.
So I like to tell that time I got called out and didn't die stories, and I like to trade them with other people, because I think that's some of how we get through that fragility, right? And I think there's so many elements of our innate humanity in that, right? Like, we are well-intentioned and we want to do a good job, and we don't want to hurt people's feelings or make them feel distress, right? And so when we find out we've done that, like, it's so hard, and we have such has such a physical reaction to it. And it can be really hard in that moment when you're having that kind of intense response to, like, breathe and take a moment and say, okay. And one of the things, I can't even remember where I read or heard this, but, and I will say, I am not great at accepting feedback at all. Not good. I try, I talk the talk, I make an effort. I still have a hard time. You know, Crystal Bailey, Squire of Foreman of Rock Creek, will tell you what a hard time I have taking constructive criticism at practice. And because it takes work and it takes practice, and you have to kind of spend some time being really uncomfortable. But one of the things that I sort of heard recently that I keep trying to pass on is this idea that feedback is a gift. That if someone is telling you, here's a thing that you did that hurt me or wasn't okay, it's because they think that you care and they think that it's worth telling you that. Like, it's not easy, right, to tell someone you screwed up or you hurt me or that thing wasn't okay. Like, that's a really uncomfortable thing to do too. And so if someone is coming to you and saying, hey, I'm going to step into this uncomfortable space and call you out or call you in, or whichever direction we're calling people this month, it's because they care and they think you matter and they think you can do better. And that's really nice. right? They're not just writing you off. They're saying, hey, here's a hard thing I'm doing to try to help you do better in the world. So that's what I try to tell myself when that happens to me. You know, I think, I mean, I can tell a handful of different specific stories about when that has happened to me and I haven't died, but I think some of the important things are to listen to the other person and hear what they're saying and not be all in your head and defensive. And also, like, you don't have to figure out what to do with it immediately in that moment. You can just say, thank you, like, I will work on that. You can say, hey, could I, you know, can I check in with you later? Is it okay to like get more clarity when I have a moment or something? Like, you can make yourself some space to figure out what to do with that experience. And I think that helps a little bit to not, for me, it helps to not have this like moment of intensity where I'm like, they told me something wrong. I'm a terrible human being. I wasn't perfect. Oh God, I hurt a person and I have to figure out how to fix it right now. Like, it's just not true. And it's hard for me to believe, right, and practice that. But it is, in fact, like, all you have to do is sort of breathe, take the feedback, and then like go find some time to figure out what to do with it.
I really appreciate that. Being an introvert, that's how I definitely am smarter the next day.
Other thoughts on receiving feedback constructively, whether that be from within your team or from without, or from your squire or foreman, or.
I just have go ahead, Tango. I talk too much. Go.
The only thing I was going to add is don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions.
Good.
Any other thoughts on receiving feedback?
I think, I can't remember if I said this or not, but the trying to not be defensive. Like, it's okay to say in your head, but I would have, you know, you don't have to let that go past your face, right? Like, you can feel it and it's okay to just like, cool, thank you. And you can, you know, you can write it in your journal, you can yell it into your voicemail, like, you can call up somebody who gets it and say, but I never meant and I never would have. But it's not super useful in that moment of getting the feedback, I think. And it's, I don't know, that can be sometimes how those interactions go south. And so I think just having that moment of editing is helpful.
What other roles are there in Morris dancing other than dancer and musician? I know we started off talking a little bit about this in terms of, well, there are fools and there are people who accompany the team and work the audience, and but how do you create human connection with those roles in relationship to dancers and musicians?
That's a great question. And I'm not going to have anything brilliant to say about it, but I really like the question a lot. And to me, I think, and some people have heard me say this before, that one of the things that to me is endlessly fascinating about the Morris is that every single time is a fresh start. And actually, a little story about that. I have twin sons, and they used to fight, and they would get mad at each other, blah, blah, blah. And then at some point, one or the other would say, fresh start. And they would both agree, okay, fresh start. And they would just like wipe it all out, and everything was good again. And I feel like every performance opportunity is a chance like that. It's an opportunity to create connection with the people who have come along with you and the people who are observing, you know, joining in, having a piece of cake or whatever they happen to be doing. There's endless opportunities for that, and the puzzle and the joy is figuring that out in the moment, for me anyway.
I think some of it is remembering that those other roles exist, right? It's so easy for us to get tunnel vision. I mean, the classic musician story, right? Of like, okay, so you seem to have a setup. What would you like us to play, right? Like, we don't tell them. And I think, you know, it's easy to get that focus that like, right, we're doing this and the dancers and you know, and I think I don't know quite how we do that, how we kind of build that into our experience and participation. But I think that's the important thing, is to remember, like, oh, so and so is going to come and is not a dancer, so like, are we making sure that person is counted and feels connected and feels part of things, or coming up with roles for, you know, the parent who's coming along with their kid, like, do you want to do more? Would you rather just sit in your chair and watch and cheer? Like, you know, noticing, I think, is really a big part of that, and just kind of looking up from our usual kind of patterns and noticing that different things are going on and trying to make space for them.
Other thoughts on roles and creating connections?
Well, just one of the things that I love, and all kinds of teams do this in different ways, are reaching out into the audience to bring someone in to actually participate. I love those kinds of things. Those are so fun.
There was a day, just to tell one dumb story that I really like, there was a day with Rock Creek in Baltimore. We were touring with the Toronto Men for something fun. And there are a lot of places around Baltimore where brides like to get their pictures taken. Like, it's a great, you know, you can stand on the edge of a pier and have billowing wind and whatever. It's very picturesque. And there was that day in Baltimore, we ended up having 5 different brides that we encountered at some point, all, you know, taking their pictures with their bridesmaids, whatever. And so there's, you know, some kind of out of the rose, or like some kind of dance that the Toronto Men routinely do where they can like lift someone up at the end. And then there's also a dance that Rock Creek does that was for one of our team members who, when she got married, that does some like crossing back and forth around a couple standing in the middle. And so we just like kind of handed back and forth the brides and just, you know, pulling in bride after bride. And some of them were like, what is going on? I don't know how I feel about this. And some of them were like, great, more pictures, let's do this, you know. And it's really a great example of, you know, pulling in the audience over and over and over.
All right. In order to be more inclusive, do we need to change definitions in some ways? Do we need a broader definition of what traditional is for Morris? Or do we need a broader definition of what folk means in terms of Morris dancing? Hard question.
Well, and endless too. I mean, these conversations have been, those definitional things are enormous. Oh my goodness. I'm too old. I'm not going to spout off. I'm going to let somebody who's younger and fresher speak up.
I mean, if folk is of the people, that's pretty broad as is. So there's no point in revising that, in my opinion.
I think we also have to make the obligatory nod towards living tradition, right? Like, this is something that has been evolving and changing. By definition, it is a thing that does that. And so I think our definition of trad and folk has changed throughout, you know, the generations. So I mean, you know, we could debate endlessly what that definition should be. I mean, I don't know that we need a broader definition to be inclusive. I mean, I agree with Tango that like it's pretty broad to begin with. But I mean, I don't have insightful things to say except that I really struggle with this idea of ethnic heritage and the Englishness of it all. And I think it's really interesting, and there's a lot of room for discussion about American Morris and how we have added and changed, and how that is its own animal from English Morris dancing. And I think that gives us a lot of room to make it work for us.
Yeah, and I think that there's, is similar to something that we were talking about earlier, that there doesn't have to be a single correct definition, that it's each community can decide, you know, the braggarts have their notion of what our tradition is, quote unquote. We don't say that that's what somebody else's tradition should be. That's the one that works for this group of people. And it has evolved over time and will continue to do so, I expect. And I think part of the ethos of the Midwest ale community is there's lots of right answers, and hooray for that. That's great. And I think that it is a dynamic tension over time, you know, because we do care about tradition, you know, and some people care very specifically about very minute parts of that tradition and will correct your position of whatever, or you know, bits and pieces, and have strong opinions. Heaven knows I have one or two. But I think within the context of this community, I think we are doing a pretty good job of saying, okay, that's what you do. Cool. This is what we're going to do. And I'm not feeling like any particular team says that they've got, you know, a lockdown on the one correct way to do it. And that we're all constantly in that tension of how much do we honor tradition and where are we moving at this moment, you know, in response to who we are, the context in which we find ourselves, all of those kinds of things. And I hope that tension never goes away.
Bob, that makes me think of a thing my therapist says constantly. She always asks me when I say, you know, I'm doing this and this and this, and like, this is how I'm, you know, running my life and it's fine. And she's like, how does that serve you? And even there was a while, you know, I moved away from DC and I didn't see her for a long time. And all the time I could just hear that little voice in the back of my head going, how does that serve you? And I think that's what I hear when you talk about the idea of which pieces are we honoring, and that, and which things are we saying, like, I don't know that blackface serves us so well anymore.
Yeah, right.
I don't know that these other elements serve us well. And so it's okay to set them down and say, you know, that worked for some other people before and it doesn't work for us now. In our version, like you're saying, with, you know, lots of different possibilities are okay. You know, we can just kind of keep assessing, like, is this piece something we want to hang on to, or is it something we want to let down? And I think we're allowed to always be making those choices.
And many of them are aesthetic, and we will, and you know, some people like red and some people prefer blue. What are you going to do? Except most of us like white,
purple,
pretty much, and for in this, anyway, whatever.
Any other thoughts about how we think about tradition, or how we think about our relationship to tradition coming out of culture? You guys brought up the English roots and the fact that we're doing this in America, so that might be different now. Okay. In that case, new question. Where are we dancing? What does that mean for how we're engaging with audiences and communities in different geographic areas? How do you choose where you're dancing? What goes or should go into thinking about where we physically dance?
As far as thinking about what goes into where we dance, think about, is the space accessible? Can people with wheelchairs get into this place? Where are we outside? Are we near a bus line? Things like that.
I also, from planning tours in DC, I think when I first joined Rock Creek 15 years ago, my sense was most of the folks lived in the suburbs, and we were doing a lot of our touring in the suburbs. And for a while, I was the only one who lived within DC proper. And I was like, we have a train system. Like, we have this great urban infrastructure. Let's go on the metro. Come on. And that feels like a shift that has very much happened. Partially, that's due to more members of our team living within the city limits and being car-free people. but also I think that's been intentional on the part of some folks, that we want to be dancing in urban, you know, in areas that you don't have to have a car to get to. We want to be dancing in, I mean, DC, all cities are annoyingly segregated. DC has some weird segregation patterns. And I think we have been thinking about, I won't say that we have succeeded, but we've been thinking about, you know, where are we dancing? Is it, you know, there's a new fountain up in Columbia Heights where lots and lots of Hispanic folks live. And so like, can we be dancing over there? And we've done, that had become for a while kind of a standard tour stop, to be up there, partially because it was a very accessible and lots of high traffic and kind of the other things you want for audience engagement, but also it wasn't just full of white people, and that felt important. And I think I, you know, have certainly been vocal in wanting to go to some other parts of the city. But there's also, I think, some of our more recent conversations have been, do we take our pub stops to Black-owned businesses? How can we be intentional about doing that kind of stuff? But also, do we want, you know, a group of 15 to 20 loud white women descending on this bar that maybe is, you know, a comfortable and safe space for communities of color? And like, are we welcome there? And we need to be kind of thoughtful and careful about that. Obviously, we have not gotten to put that into practice over the last 9 months, but it's been a thing that we've sort of been talking about both wanting to be present in more diverse communities, but then also being thoughtful about what our presence means and how we do that in a respectful way.
Yeah, I think about a lot of that in terms of relationships. I mean, the entree comes through some relationship that either a member of your team or whatever has, so that you have a sense of whether that space is an appropriate space or not. That's, at least that's been my experience. So much of this stuff is really based in relationships. We can talk about it sort of abstractly in terms of the team and the community, but in many cases, what it really comes down to is, I know this person, or I know this group of people, and because I actually already have a relationship with them, that gives me some understanding about this is appropriate or it's not.
Other thoughts about physical location and dancing? We've been talking the entire conversation about conversations. What are some ways that you have found useful, or that you know you can begin and continue these conversations in your teams?
So
I'd like to hear about the Brackleberries.
Yeah.
What's your experience, Tango? Tell me more about that, because I'm not insider to your team at all, and I know that this is something very important to you.
In terms of, I'm sorry, what, can you repeat the question again, Katie?
Yeah. So we've been talking the entire conversation about having these conversations on our team. What are some ways that you can begin or continue these type of conversations?
We just have them. Like, this is just something that I, as a person, like, grew up with my mindset, like, okay, who's here, who's not here, how can we include people who are here, what can we do for people who want to come but aren't here? It's just how I operate as a person. It's just how Elle operates. It's just how we all operate. So it's just kind of our natural speed, as it were. I guess it's just, if I were to give advice, maybe just to bring up those conversations, you have to remind yourself, like, okay, who are we, like Chris said, who are we serving? Am I being served? And just reminding yourself to constantly be aware of all these things so you don't slip out of it.
I feel like there are a handful of ways that the conversations come up. I mean, some of them are things, right? Like I was talking about this friend from Toronto saying, hey, what word are you guys using? And I went, and then brought that up with other folks on the team, said, here's this experience where I got this thrown at me. and I realized we're not having this conversation. What do you think? I feel like other conversations have started walking out to our cars from practice, you know, just with a couple people, and then kind of doing some brainstorming. I think, I do not remember which protest sort of kicked this off this summer, because there have been, unfortunately, so many, you know, Black men being killed by police. Somebody on Rock Creek, I don't keep good track of our social media, but whoever on Rock Creek is in charge of our social media put together a statement in response to that, saying, you know, and basically a declaration of being anti-racist. And I got a call from another team member, maybe 8 hours after that, saying, hey, who put that statement up? And I was like, oh God, here we go. Like, there's going to be some pushback, and I didn't even think about it. I just said, sure, go for it. And I said, oh, I think, you know, so-and-so did it on the social media channels, you know, and she said, I think it's so great. I'm so glad. I want to talk more about where we're dancing and what words we're using and how we're going to be a more anti-racist team. And we had a 2-hour phone conversation about it, with some amazing ideas and just batting stuff back and forth into, you know, just one-on-one. And it kind of came out of nowhere for me. And then I think obviously there are things like, you know, if your team has an annual meeting and a check-in, there are times where you can kind of put that on the agenda to have a broader conversation and make sure everybody gets to be part of that. You know, so you can, and I think another thing that's really important is accountability, right? That like we check in a few months from now and say, hey, so those goals, and we check in 6 months from now and a year from now, et cetera. So I think both, like, as it organically falls in your lap, and as different people kind of raise the conversation in smaller groups, you know, if you're talking about it at the pub, that's great, but like then loop in the rest of your team and say, hey, we had this great conversation and here's a thing we're thinking about. And then also I think kind of putting it in formal check-in spaces. I think all those are ways that it kind of happens, and they're all great ways, you know, like there's no way that's better than the others.
Good.
Yeah, Brackleberry is such a small team that it's not like we need to have this gigantic conversation unless something is really weighing on one of us.
Other thoughts about beginning or continuing conversations?
I also, sorry, I know I've been talking a lot, but I also just want to say, like, you don't have to start the conversation with solving racism, right? Like, I think it's really important to remember that we can take bite-sized pieces of this and make one small decision, like, what word are we going to use instead of gypsy? Great, done. Like, we did a thing, and then you get a, we did a thing, and you get to have the sticker. And that gives you movement towards, like, oh, this is not an impossible, intractable thing, right? Like, we can figure out ways to do things better and to improve. So I think it's important to just think about, like, small things you can kind of carve out, have a conversation, make a decision, and be done. And then to remember to keep doing more of those.
By the way, a comment was made in the chat about replacing half jip or whole jip with faces. Apparently it evolved into a contest to make the weirdest possible face or pantomime, which sounds particularly lovely. I like that. Any other thoughts about beginning or continuing conversations? Thank you very much. That's the end of our questions, but are there any final takeaway points that you, each of you panelists, would like to present before we end?
Oh, don't give me a soapbox.
I'm just really excited we're having these conversations. And I think every conversation that I have with folks, whether it's in the singing community or the dancing community or in other professional circles, every conversation, I feel like I learn different things. And I feel like there's such a connection, like there is with tradition, right? Where someone gives an idea or a concept to me, And then I get to come on here and natter about it to you and say, here's this thing that was helpful to me. And we get to, like, we are forming connections by sharing strategies and approaches with each other. And it's another way of strengthening our community. And it just makes me really happy.
Well said. Well said.
I will say inclusivity is achievable. You know, if you're really willing to learn and just sticking true to yourself and your principles as a team, like you will do it, and you can do it.
Any other? All right, thank you so much, panelists. That was a lot of really cool ideas for us to go forward with. This, of course, like you guys say, is the first of many panel discussions that we're planning on having as a community. One conversation is a step in the process, not an end goal. Like you say, there is no moment you're going to solve racism. Continue having these conversations on your team. Please, in the chat or in any feedback you can provide during our virtual events, let us know if you have any future topics you'd like us to talk about, or if you've heard some team is doing a specific really cool thing and you want them to talk about it. Tell us if you want us to pull specific panelists or talk to a specific team. Anything where we can continue this conversation about how to go forward and be stronger and be more inclusive. Please also, if you have any questions that have not been asked yet in the chat, please send us any questions that you'd like. Ooh, and we have a question very quickly. And do you guys want me to read this question, or can you see it?
You should read it so that for the recording, which may not include the chat, people will know what we're talking about.
Good point. So this is a dilemma from Jay Hull. So here's a dilemma that came up for our team, and I don't know what the best answer to it is. What do we as a community do about traditional tunes that may have once been had bigoted lyrics used with them? We had a couple once show up to practice once and never again because they were made so uncomfortable by one of the tunes for that reason. Obviously, we don't use any such lyrics, but what do we do about any tunes that might have an unsavory history? Are they just sort of skunked and we can't use them?
That's as a music educator, that's an issue that's coming up a lot right now amongst music educators. There was an article recently called "Dinah Put Down Your Horn," which dealt with these kinds of issues. So I'm not going to make some kind of grand pronouncement other than to say that there is a lot of concern about that. A question that would come to my mind is, are those incidental lyrics that are appended to a pre-existing piece of music, or are they inherent to the music? Are they an essential part of it? Would be a question that I would be asking, because there have been additional lyrics put to all kinds of things that would be unsavory and unacceptable. So that would be a question I would ask at any rate.
Yeah, I've seen a handful of conversations in a couple of different social media groups that are discussing, this kind of thing. And I am not an instrumental person, and so I pay more attention to the ones where you're choosing the lyrics because you're going to sing the lyrics, and having those kind of difficult conversations. But I do feel like I've seen some other threads go by where either the name of the tune or some of the lyrics in a tune that you're only playing instrumentally are pretty awful. And I've seen a wide variety of responses. And like Bob said, I don't think that there's a clear, here's when you can and here's when you can't, or here's when you should and here's when you shouldn't. And I think it's tough because you can't always anticipate. I mean, it's sort of one of my guiding principles is the idea of basically what Jay has said. It's that someone has encountered our community, heard that tune or those lyrics, and has said, wow, this is not a safe place for me to be by. Because that's what I want to avoid, right? Like that's, I don't want people to feel hurt or upset or distressed by what we're doing. But I think you can't always predict, you know, there are some tunes that I didn't even know had lyrics and someone else does, and they're gonna, you know, have a strong reaction to that. And somebody else would never have noticed. So I think it's really gnarly territory. And I think there are ongoing conversations that we have to kind of keep navigating. And I wish I had a clear like stamp of approval. Hell no. But it's, yeah, I mean, that's the stuff is we're having to kind of look back through all sorts of folk traditions and really kind of reckon with that and make some hard choices.
For me, when I learn new pieces or find new pieces, I always try to research what I can. And if I find any ounce of something that might be like racially or whatever insensitive, I just flat out don't play it. There's so much folk music out there. It's not like we don't have so much to pick from. But again, not right or wrong, just my personal experience.
Other thoughts on this, like you say, gnarly topic of taking on songs that have history. Also, feel free, anyone in the chat, if you have any additional questions you'd like our panelists to address. Okay. I think we're kind of at our end. I know we will continue to ask questions, both of panelists in the future and of each other as we continue to have these conversations. And again, please, 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 to everyone listening, including the panelists, this is one of many conversations. So if you have a topic you want addressed or a person or a team you would like to speak to a practice, let us know. This will be a cool process. Thank you so much to each of our panelists for taking the time to do some really hard thinking with us and to talk about your experiences and your thoughts. That's really awesome. And it helps us to continue to think constructively on our own teams, to hear from people who are doing that hard work too. So thank you so much.
And thank you for your thoughtful questions and organizing and facilitating. Appreciate it very much.
Also, thank you to the virtual
trusty
team
virtual guide.
our trusty virtual guide, the people who designed the panel, and all of the people facilitating this right now. There's a lot of them.